Counselor Judge Harlan Voss said, leaning back in his chair with the particular ease of a man who has never once worried about consequences. His voice so calm and so measured that it took a moment for the room to register the cruelty beneath it. I think we both know that whatever you're about to say next is going to be a very creative waste of my morning. But that wasn't where the story began. Not really. Because 2 hours before those words landed in courtroom 4B, like a stone dropped into still water, Nadia Okafor was standing in the pediatric respiratory ward of Hamilton General Hospital, holding a paper cup of lukewarm coffee she hadn't drunk, listening to the particular sound that a child makes when breathing costs effort. The ward smelled of antiseptic and something floral that someone had tried to use to cover the antiseptic, and it wasn't working, and the fluorescent lights above buzzed with a frequency that made everything feel slightly unreal, and Nadia stood at the threshold of room 14 and watched a 9-year-old girl named Lily Harmon sleep in a bed that was too big for her, her small chest rising and falling with a wheeze that the doctors said was the direct result of 6 months of living in a building where the walls grew black mold because the landlord had been promising repairs since February, and it was now October. Diana Harmon, Lily's mother, sat beside the bed with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on her daughter's face in the way that only mothers look at sick children. Like if she looked hard enough and long enough, she could simply will the illness out of the child's body through the force of love alone. Nadia had been Diana's pro bono attorney for 3 weeks ever since the eviction notice arrived, stamped official cold on a Tuesday morning when Diana had already been awake since 4 because Lily had been coughing since midnight. She didn't intend to stay long that morning before court, just long enough to reassure Diana that she had the documentation, that she had the case, that she had everything in order. But as she turned to leave, Lily opened her eyes, and they were very dark and very clear. And she looked at Nadia with the kind of directness that children have before the world teaches them to look sideways at things. Miss Nadia Lily said, her voice slightly rough from the breathing treatments, if the judge is the one in charge of making things fair, then who makes sure the judge is being fair? Nadia stood very still for a moment. She didn't have a simple answer, and she didn't pretend to have one, and she didn't give the kind of reassuring non-answer that adults usually give children when children ask questions that cut too close to the truth. She just looked at Lily and said quietly, "That's exactly what I'm going to go find out today." She adjusted her charcoal blazer in the reflection of the window. The blazer that was not expensive, was not tailored, was not from a prestigious firm's dress code, and she walked out into the October morning carrying Lily's question like a small, unextinguishable flame. Hamilton County Courthouse on a Tuesday morning had a particular kind of atmosphere that was not quite indifferent and not quite hostile, but existed somewhere in the uncomfortable space between the two. The floors were perpetually sticky with the residue of industrial floor wax. The overhead lighting cast everything in a shade of yellow that made people look slightly unwell, and the air tasted of stale coffee and old paper, and the accumulated anxiety of people who had come here not because they wanted to, but because they had no other choice. Judge Harlan Voss had occupied the bench of courtroom 4B for 22 years, and in that time he had settled into it the way a stone settles into a riverbed. Not dramatically, not with announcement, just with the gradual and absolute certainty of something that has decided it belongs there and cannot be moved. He was a tall man in his early 60s with platinum hair swept back from his forehead in a way that suggested he was aware of how it looked, and he wore his black robe with the particular ease of someone who thinks of it not as a garment of public service, but as a costume of personal authority. And when he picked up his gavel, it was not with the neutrality of a craftsman picking up a tool, but with the deliberate weight of a man who has learned that the sound it makes ends conversations before they properly begin. Nadia Okafor stood at the defense table, and she was, by every external measure, unremarkable. Her dark skin glowed warm under the harsh courthouse lighting. Her natural hair was pulled back into a tight professional bun, and her charcoal blazer was clean and pressed, but clearly not expensive, and she carried a single brown leather portfolio rather than the rolling briefcase or the retinue of junior associates that the attorney's Voss preferred tended to arrive with. Diana Harmon sat beside her, hands clasped over her purse, eyes red from a night of sitting in a hospital chair, and she was trying very hard to look composed and almost succeeding. Voss had not opened the case file. He was looking at his watch. "Miss," he began, not looking at the file, not looking at Nadia, just looking at his watch as though the name was somewhere on the watch face and he simply hadn't found it yet. "Whatever your name is, this motion is frivolous. Your client hasn't paid rent in 3 months. The law is clear. Why are you wasting my time with these hardship excuses?" Nadia stepped forward, and her voice was the kind of calm that is not the absence of feeling, but the deliberate containment of it, like water held behind glass. "Your Honor, if you look at Exhibit B, you'll find that the landlord, Mr. Raymond Galt, refused to accept the emergency rental assistance payments that were issued and delivered by certified mail. Under current state statute, an eviction cannot proceed while an emergency assistance application is pending. I'm simply asking for a stay of the order while the documentation is reviewed." Voss turned to look at her. Then, not with interest, but with the particular expression of a man who has just been interrupted by something he has decided in advance is not worth his attention the way you might look at a fly that has landed on your newspaper. "I don't need a lecture on statutes from a community advocate." He said, his voice very pleasant, almost gentle in the way that certain cruelties are delivered pleasantly, because the person delivering them has done it so many times that it no longer requires any emotional investment. "I've been on this bench for 22 years, and Mr. Galt is a respected businessman in this community. If he says the payments didn't arrive, they didn't arrive. I have a docket to manage. Your Honor, I have a certified mail receipt showing." The gavel came down with a sound like a door slamming in an empty house. "I didn't give you the floor to argue," Voss said, and now the pleasantness had a harder edge underneath it, the way ice sounds when it begins to crack. "I gave you the floor to hear my ruling. The motion for a stay is denied. The eviction stands. Miss Harmon has 48 hours to vacate the premises." He was already reaching for the next file. Diana made a sound small, choked the sound of someone who has been bracing for a blow and finds when it lands that bracing didn't help, and Nadia placed her hand on Diana's shoulder without looking away from the bench. "Your Honor," Nadia said, and her voice had changed. It had dropped an octave and become something colder and more precise, like a scalpel rather than a hammer. "This ruling is in direct violation of the State Supreme Court's decision in Hargrove versus the City Housing Authority, which establishes clear precedent that a landlord's refusal to accept properly issued assistance payments constitutes a waiver of the eviction right for that period. You are committing a reversible error that will cause irreparable harm to this family. I move for an immediate stay pending interlocutory appeal." Beverly Norris, the court reporter, stopped typing. It was a small thing. Her fingers simply paused above the keys hovering there in the sudden stillness. But Nadia noticed it, and so did the 6 people sitting in the public gallery, and so eventually did Voss, who turned his head toward Beverly with a slight frown before turning it back to Nadia, and something in his expression had shifted from comfortable dismissal to something that was not quite anger, but was adjacent to it. "You want to talk about the Supreme Court?" Voss said, setting his pen down with deliberate care. "How about we talk about the decorum of this courtroom first? You are out of order. You are being disrespectful. And quite frankly, Counselor, I don't think you have the intellectual capacity to understand the nuances of the rulings I make in this court." The gallery went very quiet. Not the polite quiet of people who have been told to keep silent, but the deep, uneasy quiet of people who have just heard something said aloud that should not have been said, that crosses a line they can all feel, even if they couldn't articulate exactly where the line is. And a woman in the 3rd row of the gallery put her hand over her mouth, and a young man near the aisle shifted forward in his seat as though he might stand up. Nadia did not flinch. She did not flush. She did not look away. She did not adjust her posture or touch her hair or do any of the small involuntary things that a person does when they have been publicly humiliated. She simply stood there in the silence, and the stillness of her was not the stillness of shock, but of someone who has encountered this particular species of contempt before, who has catalogued it and filed it, who knows exactly what it is and exactly what to do with it. "I am asking for the law to be followed, Your Honor," she said, and her voice was so even, so precisely calibrated that it made Voss's words echo back across the courtroom, in contrast louder in the silence she gave them than they had been when he spoke them. "If that is disrespectful in this chamber, then perhaps the issue isn't my conduct." Voss's knuckles tightened around the gavel. "That is enough," he said. "I find you in summary contempt of court. You are fined $5,000 payable immediately to the clerk's office. Bailiff, this woman is to be removed from my courtroom." And here is the thing about Nadia Okafor that no one in that room yet understood. She had been waiting with extraordinary patience for exactly this moment. And now that it had arrived, she moved with the unhurried deliberation of someone executing a plan that has been ready for a long time. She reached into her brown leather portfolio and withdrew a small card. Gold-embossed, weighty, the kind that arrives before the consequences do, and she held it up not toward the bailiff who was approaching, but at an angle just sufficient for Beverly Norris to see it clearly from the court reporter's desk. "I'll pay the fine, Your Honor," Nadia said, and there was something in her voice now that had not been there before. Not triumph, not gloating, but a kind of quiet, terrible calm, like the moment before a very large thing falls. "But I would suggest you keep the receipt. You're going to need it when the Judicial Qualifications Commission asks for your version of events." Voss laughed, a short, harsh sound. "The commission. I am the institution in this town," Bailiff Beverly Nadia said, turning toward the court reporter, and her voice was perfectly steady, perfectly clear. "Please make sure the full transcript of this exchange is on record, including the remarks about my intellectual capacity. I want a certified copy on my desk by 2 o'clock. Beverly looked up, and there was something in her expression, not fear exactly, but a kind of heightened awareness. The look of a person who understands. They are witnessing something that will matter. And she said in a voice that trembled only slightly, "Yes, President Okafor." The word landed in the courtroom, the way a very heavy object lands when dropped from a height, not with drama, but with a kind of finality that reorganizes everything around it. "President." Voss's gavel stopped halfway to the block. The murmur that went through the gallery was not loud, but it was unanimous. Every person in that room turning toward their neighbor, the same question in every pair of eyes, and Beverly was already looking at her screen, her fingers still, her face giving nothing away, and the young clerk in the corner had his phone out, not raised, but angled his thumb, not quite moving. Voss said in a voice that had lost all its pleasant surface and sounded suddenly hollow underneath, "What did you just call her?" "But Nadia." Okafor did not wait for the answer. She turned her back to the bench, a gesture so deliberate and so complete that it was louder than any word she could have spoken, and she took Diana Harmon's arm gently and walked her toward the doors, her heels striking the marble floor in a steady, unhurried rhythm, and she did not look back at the man whose career had just begun its final descent, not once, not even at the door. The heavy oak panels swung shut behind them, and the sound they made echoed in the sudden absolute silence of a courtroom that had just witnessed something it would be talking about for a very long time. In the clerk's alcove, Tommy Briggs, 26 years old, 8 months into the job, still idealistic enough to be disturbed by what he'd just seen, was already pulling up the State Bar Association website on his phone, his hands moving quickly. His expression the particular expression of a young person who has just realized that the ground under their feet is not as solid as they believed. And outside, through the tall windows of courtroom 4, B. Voss could see, though he could not yet bring himself to look, a black sedan pulling to the curb in the courthouse plaza below and a woman stepping out with a camera. The private chambers of Judge Harlan Voss smelled of leather polish and old ambition, and by 3 in the afternoon they smelled also of Raymond Galt's sweat, which was the particular kind of sweat that belongs to wealthy men who have suddenly realized their wealth may not be enough to save them. Galt was 54 years old, broad across the shoulders, the kind of man who filled a room not with charm, but with volume. He had spent 30 years building a real estate empire in Hamilton County, on the principle that the path between an idea and its execution should be as short as possible. And if the law occasionally stood in that path, then the law was a problem to be managed rather than a reality to be respected. "You told me this was settled," Preston Galt said, not sitting, moving instead in a tight, agitated circuit around the Persian rug. His silk tie loosened his jacket already draped over the back of a chair, as though he'd arrived planning to stay and work. "You told me the girl would be out by Thursday so we could start the renovation permits. I have contractors. I have financing in place. I have a buyer lined up for the luxury conversion who is not a patient man. And now I have a reporter from the Chronicle outside my front door asking about statutory violations and predatory practices." Voss sat behind his desk and said nothing, which was new for him. The silence of a man who has discovered very suddenly that the ground he was standing on was not bedrock but ice, and the ice has already cracked. "I didn't know who she was," Voss said finally, and even as he said it, he could hear how inadequate it sounded, how it was the sentence of a man who was already trying to construct a defense rather than a man who believed himself innocent of anything worth defending. "You didn't look," Galt said, and his voice dropped from volume to something colder, which was somehow worse. "That's the problem, Preston. You never look. You see what you expect to see, and you act accordingly, and it's worked for 22 years because the people you didn't look at couldn't afford to make you regret it." He stopped moving and turned to face Voss directly. "She can. The bar handles ethics, not criminal matters. She can file a complaint. They can." "The bar," Galt said slowly, as though explaining something to someone who is not following, "is the least of your concerns right now." He placed his hands on the edge of the desk and leaned forward. "Do you know who Nadia Okafor's husband is?" Voss looked at him. "David Okafor," Galt said. "Assistant Regional Director, FBI White Collar Crime Division." The clock on the wall ticked 4 times in the silence that followed. Voss looked at the gavel on his desk, the physical gavel, the actual wooden thing he had picked up and put down 10,000 times in 22 years, and for the first time in his career, it looked like what it actually was, a small piece of wood with no more power than the institution that had lent it to him, and that institution was no longer entirely sure it was on his side. "You didn't just kick a hornet's nest," Preston Galt said, straightening up, reaching for his jacket. "You walked into the center of it and started swinging." He paused at the door. "Fix it. Whatever fixing it costs, it costs. Because if she starts pulling on the thread with her husband, what unravels is not just you." The door closed, and Voss sat alone in his chambers, surrounded by his diplomas and his leather-bound law volumes and 22 years of absolute certainty that had curdled in the space of one Tuesday morning into something he couldn't name but could feel very clearly in the hollow of his chest. The lobby of Hamilton County Courthouse was not a space designed for spectacle, but it had a good acoustics and excellent light coming through its tall east-facing windows in the afternoon. And Nadia Okafor understood both of these things when she walked to the payment window at precisely 2:15. Brenda Wells, the clerk behind the glass, had already heard the building's internal messaging system had been working steadily since 11 that morning, and by now everyone from the security desk to the filing room knew that the woman Voss had fined for contempt was not who she appeared to be. And Brenda's hands were not entirely steady when she pushed the service window open. "They called from the judge's office," Brenda said carefully. They said there was a clerical error. They said the fine is being rescinded. It was issued in open court, Nadia said. It's on the record. If I don't pay it, I'm in violation of a judicial order and I don't violate the law, Brenda, even when the law is being used as a weapon by the person holding the gavel. She nodded to the young man standing behind her, who stepped forward and placed a large, heavy briefcase on the payment counter with a careful solidity that made Brenda look down at it with a slight frown. The clasps opened. Inside, arranged in no particular order but present in their full and complete amount, were thousands of coins, nickels, dimes, pennies, quarters, catching the afternoon light and glittering with an almost festive abundance that was somehow the most devastating thing anyone in the lobby had ever seen. $5,000, Nadia said pleasantly. In legal tender. I'll need a formal receipt. Itemize it as evidence collection for a judicial misconduct file, please. Lydia Marsh, who had positioned herself near the water fountain with a camera operator, captured the exact moment that Brenda Wells looked at the coins, looked at Nadia, and looked back at the coins. Nadia turned toward the camera with the expression of a woman who has been waiting to make exactly this statement for exactly this long. I am less concerned about what was done to me today, she said, than about the thousands of people who walk into that courtroom without the protection of my title. If Judge Voss treats the president of the bar this way, how does he treat the single mother? How does he treat the veteran? How does he treat the person who can't afford an attorney? She paused, and the pause had weight. Today, Judge Voss showed us that he doesn't see people. He sees targets. And the Bar Association has a very particular way of dealing with judges who forget that their robe is a garment of service, not a cloak of immunity. Before Lydia could follow up with a question, Nadia's phone gave a single quiet chime, and she glanced at it, and then looked back at the reporter with something that was almost a smile. You might want to check the docket for the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, Nadia said, tucking the phone away. I filed an emergency writ of mandamus 20 minutes ago. I'm not just challenging the contempt. Fine, I'm challenging every eviction order Judge Voss has signed in the last 6 months on the basis of his pattern of failure to apply the state's emergency rental assistance statutes. The lobby, which had been murmuring, went still. Lydia's pen stopped moving above her notepad. The writ, if granted, would not merely put Voss in conflict with the bar, it would make him personally liable for a legal catastrophe of a scale that would collapse Raymond Galt's development empire, expose every political alliance Voss had spent 2 decades cultivating, and reopen the cases of hundreds of people who had lost their homes in courtroom 4B and walked away believing the law had simply not been on their side. This isn't a professional dispute, Nadia said quietly, for the recording, for the record, for the people in the lobby who had stopped pretending they weren't listening. This is a reckoning. She picked up her portfolio, nodded once to Brenda, who was already reaching for the coin-counting machine with the resigned expression of a woman who understands that history sometimes asks you to count a very large number of pennies, and walked out into the afternoon light, not hurrying, not looking back. By 3 p.m, the Hamilton County Courthouse had developed the particular atmospheric quality of a building in which something has gone wrong, and everyone knows it and no one is saying it directly. The way a ship lists slightly before the crew announces the list. The hallways were not louder than usual, but the conversations in them were shorter, more clipped, happening in doorways rather than offices, and people moved with the slightly too purposeful stride of individuals who want to appear busy enough not to be asked questions. Voss's colleagues avoided the corridor outside his chambers with elaborate casualness, finding reasons to use the back stairwell to take the long route to the filing room to suddenly remember appointments in other wings of the building. Not because they knew everything, but because they knew enough. And knowing enough in a courthouse is sometimes worse than knowing everything because it gives you just enough uncertainty to stay still and just enough clarity to feel implicated. Tommy Briggs sat alone in the clerk's anteroom with the certified transcript on the screen in front of him and the particular expression of a 26-year-old who has spent 8 months telling himself that the things he was seeing were probably normal, were probably just how things worked. when you got up close to the machinery of the law, were probably not worth the disruption of saying something, and who has now in the space of one morning run out of, probably. Galt's number appeared on Voss's phone 4 times between 2 and 3 o'clock. Voss did not answer. At 3:17, Chief Judge Bernard Holt knocked on the door of Voss's chambers without waiting for a response, which was a thing he had never done in 11 years of sharing this building, and the knock itself communicated more than most full sentences would have. Holt placed 2 items on the desk. The first was a 1-page administrative order bearing the seal of the State Supreme Court authorizing the immediate suspension of Judge Harlan Voss, pending a full investigation into judicial conduct and financial relationships with litigants appearing before his court. The second was a white envelope containing a formal notice requiring Raymond Galt to present himself to a State Bureau of Investigation interview room by 9 the following morning. Bernard Voss began. "Your security card and your key to the building," Holt said, and his voice was not unkind, but it was absolutely final. The voice of an institution closing a door. "It has decided, must stay closed. I'll need them before you leave." Voss held the key in his hand for a long moment, the physical key brass slightly worn at the teeth from years of use. And it was strange how much smaller it felt now than it had this morning, when it had been simply the key to his office and not the last tangible object of an authority that was already dissolving. He placed it on the desk. The October light was doing something beautiful with the courthouse steps at 4 in the afternoon, turning the limestone gold, warming the ordinarily cold institutional face of the building into something almost hospitable. And Nadia was standing in that light when Diana Harmon came through the side entrance at a half-run, her purse swinging, her eyes wide and wet. The call had come 20 minutes earlier. The eviction order was suspended pending investigation. Diana could return to her apartment. No one was taking her home. Diana stopped in front of Nadia and opened her mouth and closed it again, the words, whatever they were going to be, apparently not quite adequate to the moment, and Nadia reached into her portfolio and held out a key. It was a simple brass key on a plain ring, the kind that could be duplicated at any hardware store, and it was in its ordinariness the most consequential object Nadia had handled all day. "It's a unit in the Callaway Cooperative Building on Morrison Street," Nadia said. "It's managed by a resident board. All maintenance requests are in writing, and the board has never in 14 years of operation refused a legally issued assistance payment." She pressed the key into Diana's palm and closed her fingers around it. "The first year's rent has been paid from a fund. You'll receive the documentation by Friday." Diana looked down at the key in her fist and then up at Nadia. And then she made a sound that was not quite crying and not quite laughing, but lived somewhere in the complicated territory between the two, where relief and grief and gratitude all occupy the same space, because they have been waiting too long in too small a room. Nadia stood beside her in the fading light and did not speak and did not move and did not offer the kind of brisk reassurance that would have filled the silence but would also have shortened it. And the silence was important. Nadia understood, because Diana had been carrying a weight for a very long time, and when you finally put a weight down, you need a moment to feel the absence of it in your hands before you can move forward. Lydia Marsh, standing 30 feet away, did not raise her camera. Some moments are not for the record. The pediatric ward at Hamilton General was quieter in the evening. The sharp daytime efficiency of it softened into something gentler, nurses moving with less urgency. The overhead lights dimmed to a yellow that was almost warm, and Lily Harmon was sitting up in her hospital bed. When Nadia arrived, color in her cheeks, a cup of apple juice on the tray beside her, a well-worn sketchbook open in her lap. Nadia noticed considerably more alert than she had been that morning, which the nurse in the doorway attributed to the second round of breathing treatment, and which Nadia attributed also to the particular resilience of 9-year-olds who are often more durable than the adults worrying about them. "Mom said you fixed it," Lily said, without preamble, in the direct way of children who consider unnecessary social framing to be an inefficient use of available time. "We made some progress today," Nadia said. "She said you're going to stay in a new apartment." "That's right." Lily considered this for a moment with the gravity of someone evaluating a significant piece of information, and then she reached into her sketchbook and pulled out a single folded page and held it out. Nadia unfolded it carefully. It was a drawing in colored pencil, the lines slightly uneven in the way that children's drawings are, the proportions slightly large-headed in the way that children's drawings are, and it showed a woman in a dark blazer standing in front of a very large building, and around her smaller figures, and all of them were looking up at the woman, and the woman was looking straight ahead, not at any of them, but for all of them, and at the bottom of the page, in the slightly labored block letters of a child who is still mastering the relationship between what she means and what the letters will carry, it read, "The one who stays." Nadia looked at the drawing for a long time. She did not for once manage to keep her face entirely still. "I drew it this morning," Lily said, watching her carefully. "Before you came. Mom said you were going to court." I thought she paused, searching for the right way to say it. "I thought maybe you should know that someone was watching." Nadia folded the drawing with care, the same careful precision she had brought to every document she had handled all day, and placed it in her portfolio beside the gold-embossed card and the receipt for $5,000 in coins. "Someone was," she said quietly. When she stood to leave, Lily called after her, and this time the question she asked was the same question she had asked that morning in this same room. But the words carried a different weight now, because in the morning it had been a question open and uncertain, tilting upward at the end, and now it was a statement level and sure, a thing that had been asked in uncertainty and answered in full. The Hamilton County Administrative Annex at 6 in the morning was the kind of building that only exists in the minds of the public as a theoretical concept. A place where government paperwork goes to wait, and Clara Webb had spent enough years inside it to have stopped seeing it the way other people saw it, and to have started seeing it the way a forensic accountant sees a balance sheet as a document in which the truth is present reliably in the places where the numbers don't add up. She was standing in front of a paper shredder that had jammed. It was, Clara thought, gazing at the tangled mass of half-destroyed bank statements protruding from the machine's feeder, like a paper tumor, almost poetic, that a man who had operated for 22 years on the principle that his confidence was a form of protection had been so confident for so long that his carelessness had become a kind of architecture, and the architecture was now visible to anyone who knew how to look at it. She pulled the pages free gently with the care of a conservator, handling damaged materials, and spread them on the folding table beside the machine, and what she saw in the first 4 minutes of looking was enough to confirm what she had already suspected from the preliminary financial intelligence that had come across her desk the previous evening. This was not the mess of a man trying to hide something. This was the mess of a man who had long ago stopped believing he needed to. Her phone rang at 6:17. "We're in David Okafor," said, and his voice had the particular quality of focused calm that Nadia would have recognized the family resemblance in temperament, if not in method. The house in the Pinecrest gated community was the kind of house that announced its owner's self-conception before you reached the front door columns. A circular driveway landscaping so aggressively maintained that it looked less like nature and more like an argument about what nature should aspire to, and David Okafor walked through its front entrance at 6:22 with a federal warrant and 4 agents and the particular economy of motion that belongs to people who do not need to perform their authority because their authority is not in question. The library was on the second floor, which David had estimated from the exterior sightlines before they went in, and it was exactly what he had anticipated. Floor-to-ceiling shelves, a mahogany desk. The kind of room designed to tell visitors something specific about the man who occupied it. The room of a man who wanted to be surrounded by the symbols of gravity and learning in the same way that a person who is not warm wants to be surrounded by paintings of fires. Above the wet bar occupying the wall, with the kind of prominence usually reserved for portraits of founders, hung a large oil painting of a blindfolded Lady Justice, rendered in dark, dramatic oils, the scales tipped very slightly, in a direction that the painter might have intended as neutral, but which David found standing in front of it to be unmistakably deliberate. He reached up and swung the canvas away from the wall on its hinges. The biometric safe was recessed into the plaster behind it. Matte steel digital keypad, the kind that a certain class of buyer purchases because it feels serious, but the digital forensics specialist had it open in 11 minutes, and what was inside it was not what serious men keep in serious safes. There was cash banded $410,000 in denominations that suggested a long-running and casual relationship with untraceable income. And there were 6 slim leather notebooks, black-numbered on the spine in gold, labeled in the cramped, precise hand of a man who believed in documentation in the dark comedy of that belief Project Pillar Volumes 1 through 6. David opened the first notebook and read for 4 minutes without speaking. What Project Pillar contained was not merely a record of bribes. It was a comprehensive operational manual for the maintenance of a private power structure built over 2 decades inside the public institution of the Hamilton County Judiciary. Names of police officers who had accepted payments to lose evidence. Names of city council members with gambling debts that had been quietly acquired as leverage names of attorneys who had agreed to throw cases in exchange for future favorable rulings in unrelated matters, a whole quiet architecture of corruption documented with the fastidious confidence of a man who had never once imagined that anyone would ever read it. David turned to the back of the 6th volume and stopped. He read the page twice. Then he took out his phone and called his wife. Raymond Galt in an interrogation room was a very different proposition from Raymond Galt in a judge's chambers stripped of the environment that had always confirmed his self-image. The silk tie now limp, the expensive shirt showing the kind of dark patches at the collar that money cannot prevent. When a man is genuinely afraid, he looked like what he had always actually been underneath the volume in the acquisition, a man who had built his life on the premise that other people's vulnerability was a resource to be extracted. Clara Webb sat across from him with a legal pad and a pen, and the face of a person who has heard every version of every explanation and is not waiting for a new one. She told him what he was facing: racketeering, bribery of a judicial officer, tax evasion, and civil rights violations, which was. She noted just the preliminary list, and the audit of Hamilton Development Group had only just begun. And she told him in the tone of a person reading a weather report, which is to say with complete accuracy and without drama because the facts were dramatic enough without any assistance from her delivery. Galt said that he was just doing business. Clara said that 3 children in his Renfield Street building had been hospitalized for respiratory illness in the past 18 months, and that the building inspector's report recommending mold remediation had been filed with his property management office on 4 separate occasions and ignored on 4 separate occasions, and that Galt had been aware of this, and that awareness combined with inaction in the context of a minor child's health had a legal name. She slid the asset freeze order across the table. Galt picked it up. He read the first paragraph, and then he set it down, and he picked up the paper cup of lukewarm water, and he held it for a moment, and then his hand opened, and the cup tipped, and the water ran across the surface of the table and dripped over the edge onto the floor, and he did not move to stop it. Just watched it go, the way a person watches something fall when the catching instinct has already given up. "He has a ledger," Galt said. Clara's pen did not stop moving. "Every payment I ever made to him is in there." Galt continued, his voice now coming from somewhere much quieter, much older than the man who had filled Voss's office with righteous anger that afternoon. "He kept it because he didn't trust me. He wanted something to hold over me if I ever stopped." A pause. "I never thought he'd need to use it. I never thought anyone would find it." "Tell me about the first payment," Clara said without looking up. If you've been watching this story from the beginning, you already know that what started as a $5,000 fine in a small-town courtroom has become something much larger, and the final revelation hasn't arrived yet. Stay with our channel, because the next chapter is the one that changes everything. Nadia arrived at the FBI field office at 9 that evening, still in her courtroom clothes, her portfolio tucked under her arm, and David met her in the corridor outside the digital forensics lab, rather than inside it, which she noticed and which told her something before he said anything. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just turned and led her inside and pointed at the screen. The case file was from 2012, a property dispute land use permit, a small construction company versus a rival developer. And the plaintiff's name was Elias Okafor. And Nadia stood in front of the screen and read it with the focused silence of someone who already knows somewhere in the part of themselves that knows things, before the evidence confirms them what they are going to find. Elias Okafor had been her father's younger brother, the man who had sat beside her at her father's funeral when she was 19, and told her with the absolute conviction of someone who believed completely in what they were saying that he would make sure she finished law school, that her father had wanted that more than anything, that it was going to happen, and it had happened because Elias had paid for it for 3 years, while also running the construction company he had built from nothing over 15 years of 6-day weeks and early mornings. The company had collapsed in 2013. Voss had ruled against Elias on the basis of a clerical error in the property deed that the filing records which Clara's team had pulled that afternoon showed clearly had never existed. The punitive sanctions Voss had attached to the ruling were calibrated, and this was the word that David used, calibrated with the precision of a man who has been reading Project Pillar for 6 hours, calibrated to make recovery impossible without being obviously disproportionate to anyone not looking closely. Elias had lost the company, then the house, then his health in the orderly and accelerating sequence of a life being systematically dismantled from the outside, while appearing to everyone, including Elias, to be simply a man who had failed. He had died of a heart attack in 2015. He was 51 years old. He had told Nadia in the last conversation she'd had with him that he was sorry. He hadn't been smarter, hadn't been more careful, hadn't seen it coming. And Nadia had told him there was nothing to be sorry for, and she had believed it because she hadn't known what she was looking at. At the bottom of the entry in Volume 3 of Project Pillar, in Voss's cramped, precise hand, HDG paid $50,000 for the ruling. Okafor, too stubborn to settle. Needed to make an example. Easy win. Nadia stood in front of the screen for a long time. He didn't fail, she said, and her voice was very quiet and very level. The voice of something that has been burning for a long time, at a temperature low enough not to be visible. He was robbed. He was, David said softly. And Voss didn't count on one thing. Nadia turned to look at him. He didn't count on the niece, David said. The Judicial Qualifications Commission hearing room was everything that courtroom 4B was not: small, low-ceilinged, lit by LED panels that produced a light so neutral it seemed to have removed all possibility of theater from the space, which was, Nadia suspected, entirely intentional, because what happened in this room was not theater, but accounting. There was no elevated bench. The panel 3 judges from neighboring counties and 2 civilian members sat at a long table at the same height as everyone else in the room, which was either a design choice or a philosophy, and Justice Beatrice Harlow, who occupied the center chair, operated with the brisk, unsentimental efficiency of someone who understands that the dignity of the process depends on not allowing it to become a performance. Voss sat at a table to the left in a gray suit that looked in this flat, white light slightly too large for him, not because it didn't fit, but because the room had a way of making men smaller than they were accustomed to being, removing the architecture of authority they usually inhabited and leaving just the person. His attorney arranged and rearranged the documents in front of him with the concentrated focus of a man trying very hard to look like he is working rather than waiting. Nadia came in through the back and sat in the front row, crossing her legs, opening her notebook, and did not look at Voss. Not because she was avoiding his gaze, but because he was not the reason she was here, and her attention went where her purpose went, and her purpose was the record. The door opened again at 9:47. Tommy Briggs walked in. He had not slept. This was visible in the particular gray quality of his skin and the slight imprecision of his movements, but his face had the expression of a person who has made a decision that costs something and has already paid the cost, and is now on the other side of it, simply moving forward. He sat at the witness table, and he spoke for 11 minutes, and what he said was careful and specific, and evidenced the instruction to flag Galt's cases. The manipulation of the scheduling rotation, the mornings when he had arrived early and found envelopes on the corner of Voss's desk that were gone by the time anyone else arrived, and the afternoon in February when a pipe in the men's room had sent him looking under the vanity panel for the shut-off valve, and he had found instead a bundled collection of cash and handwritten ledger pages tucked into the space between the cabinet and the wall. Voss said Tommy was lying. He stood up to say it, the old reflex. The impulse toward the elevated position, the carrying voice, and Justice Harlowe's gavel came down once cleanly, and she said, "Sit down, Mr. Voss. You no longer hold the gavel in this room. You are the subject of this proceeding, and you will conduct yourself accordingly." The search warrant had been executed at Voss's home that morning. Justice Harlowe informed the room Project Pillar had been located secured and was already in the hands of the state forensic accounting team, which rendered Tommy's testimony in terms of the investigation largely confirmatory, rather than initiating, but no less important for that, because what Tommy described was not the action of a man who had made a series of bad decisions. It was the culture of a court that had been operating for years as a private enterprise. Voss looked at Nadia. It was the first time since the hearing began that he had looked at her directly, and what was in his face was not the cool contempt of the courtroom or the frightened bluster of his chambers. It was something she had not seen on him before. Something raw and less organized, the face of a man beginning to understand the full architecture of what he had built and what it was costing him. Nadia was writing. Her pen moved across the notebook in steady, unhurried strokes, not looking at him, not registering his gaze, simply documenting which was the thing she had always done, and the thing that in this particular case had mattered more than anything else she could have done. At the close of the preliminary proceedings, Justice Harlowe invited Nadia to address the panel in her capacity as president of the State Bar Association, and Nadia set down her pen and stood and turned, and for the first time looked directly at Harlan Voss. She did not speak about the law. She asked him one question when he had looked at her across his courtroom on Tuesday morning when he had seen her standing at the defense table in her charcoal blazer with her brown leather portfolio and no retinue of clerks. Had he seen a lawyer or had he seen a shadow? He thought he could step on without looking down. Voss did not answer. He looked at his hands, which were folded on the table in front of him, and he kept looking at them, and the silence went on long enough that it became its own kind of answer. Nadia turned slightly, not yet facing the door, and said not to Voss, not to the panel, but to the record that the people who came into courtrooms without her title came in hoping for the same thing she had always hoped for, to be seen as a full human being by the person holding the gavel, and that this was not a complex request, and it was not an unreasonable one, and it was the foundational premise of the entire enterprise of justice, and when a judge forgot it, he did not merely fail the law, he failed the reason the law existed. She walked out. The door closed behind her with a sound that was very quiet and very final. 6 months is long enough for a city to reorganize itself around a new understanding of what it is, and Hamilton County had done exactly that slowly and perfectly with the particular combination of embarrassment and determination that belongs to communities that have discovered something about themselves they would have preferred not to know and have decided nonetheless to look at it clearly. The courthouse steps on the morning of sentencing were crowded in a way they had never been before, not with the usual stream of reluctant litigants and hurrying attorneys, but with people who had come because they wanted to, who had taken the morning off work or arranged childcare, or driven from other parts of the county, because something was being concluded today that had been a long time arriving and they wanted to be present when it arrived. Diana Harmon stood on the third step from the bottom in a simple blue dress, her shoulders back, her chin level. The posture not of someone performing composure, but of someone who has genuinely arrived at it, who has spent 6 months building a life in a building whose landlord follows the law, whose daughter sleeps through the night without coughing, and who has found in that stability the ability to stand up straight without effort. Inside courtroom 1. The largest in the building, opened for the occasion. The gallery divided itself with a precision that no one had organized on one side. The legal community of the state members of the bar, and the judiciary, who had come to witness the formal conclusion of a disciplinary and criminal proceeding of a kind that had not occurred in this county in living memory. And on the other side, the people Voss had spent 22 years not seeing the evicted, the falsely ruled against the families of the bankrupted, the veterans whose documented evidence had been dismissed, all of them present, all of them here. Harlan Voss sat at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit. His platinum hair, no longer swept and arranged, fell forward slightly over his forehead, and without the black robe and the elevated bench and the gavel in his hand. He was simply an aging man in an ill-fitting garment, and the room which he had once commanded did not arrange itself around him, the way it once had it arranged itself today around the people on the other side of the aisle. Judge Howard Blackwell entered and took his seat, and the room settled, and he said before opening the sentencing documents that the court would hear victim impact statements, and that they would hear as many as wished to be given, and that he intended to listen to each one. Derek Walsh came first, walking with the slight catch in his stride that he had come back from his military service with, carrying it without comment as he had for 11 years. And he stood at the podium and described in the measured voice of a man who has rehearsed this in his head many times, but has made peace with the emotion still present underneath it the afternoon that Voss had laughed at the documentation he had brought, the documentation that proved the loan on his grandfather's farm was fraudulent, and had ruled for the bank in the same breath, and had said as Derek was leaving that patriots pay their debts, and Derek had paid his with his grandfather's farm and his grandfather's last 2 years. Abigail Foster, 79, told the court about the January night 4 years ago when she had found herself standing on a sidewalk with 2 suitcases in 17-degree weather because the sheriff's deputy had arrived at 8 in the morning, and she had not yet called anyone because she had believed until that moment that the stay of eviction her attorney had filed would protect her, not knowing that it had been denied the previous afternoon in a 5-minute hearing that Voss had scheduled without notifying her attorney. Others followed. When Nadia rose and walked to the podium, the room went quiet in a different way, the particular quiet that attends the presence of someone whose measure the room has already taken. She did not speak as the Bar Association president. She spoke about her uncle Elias, about the man who had believed so completely in the promise of this country that he had worked 15 years to build something, and had not, when it was taken from him, been able to conceive that it had been taken deliberately, because the alternative that the system he had trusted could be purchased and turned against him was too large a disillusionment to survive, and so he had blamed himself instead, and carried that blame until it stopped his heart. He thought he failed, Nadia said, and her voice was steady, and she let the steadiness do the work that volume or tears might have done in a lesser person. He never failed. He was robbed. And today, in this room, we name it for what it was. She looked at Voss, then not with anger, not with triumph, with the clear-eyed steadiness of a woman who has arrived after a very long journey at a place she intended to reach. The robe, she said, is a garment of service, not a cloak of immunity. Today we restore the difference. She sat down. There was no applause. There was only the sound of people breathing in a room that had just heard something it needed to hear, and the silence that followed was not empty but full of the weight of what had been said and the weight of what it meant. And Blackwell let it stand for a moment before he turned to the defense table. Voss was given the opportunity to speak before sentencing, and he took it, which was the last in a long series of misjudgments. He spoke about the order he had brought to the county, about the businesses he had supported, about the decisions he had made in the service of stability. And as he spoke, the room grew quieter, in the way that a room grows quiet when it is hearing something it cannot believe is still being said, when the gap between what a person understands about their situation and what they are willing to acknowledge is so vast that it has become in itself a kind of confession. His attorney placed a hand on his arm. Voss sat down. Blackwell looked at him for a long moment over his reading glasses with the expression of a man who has heard many things in many courtrooms and has learned to let the silence do the accounting. "Mr. Voss," Blackwell said, and his voice had the quality of a statement that has been a long time forming and is now at last being made. "You speak of order. But order in service of private interest is not order, it is control, and the law does not protect control. It protects people." He opened the sentencing document. "For the counts of racketeering bribery of a judicial officer, civil rights violations, and money laundering, I sentence you to 22 years in the state penitentiary without eligibility for early release. All assets under your name, including real property investment accounts and vehicles, are hereby seized under civil forfeiture statutes and will be liquidated into the Hamilton Restitution Fund, to be administered by a committee appointed by the State Bar Association and overseen by an independent judicial monitor." Voss said, "Everything Blackwell said. You left Derek Walsh with nothing. You left Abigail Foster in the snow. You left Elias Okafor with a bankruptcy he didn't earn and a shame he didn't deserve. You are receiving the precise harvest of what you planted." He nodded to the bailiff. "Remove the prisoner." Voss began to protest, to argue, to appeal to the room, and it was the sound of a man whose authority was entirely internal, now entirely self-referential. A gavel swinging in a room with no bench, hitting nothing, making no sound that anyone was obligated to hear. The steel door at the side of the courtroom closed behind him with a sound like a period at the end of a very long sentence. In the corridor outside the holding area, Voss was being processed toward the transport vehicle when Lily Harmon came around the corner with Diana, who had been allowed into the building for the victim impact statement and was now collecting her coat from the public waiting area. Lily was wearing a dress with small yellow flowers on it and carrying her sketchbook under her arm, and she looked up at Voss the way that children look at things that they do not yet have a framework for directly, without fear, without judgment, with the pure and unmediated attention of someone who has not yet learned that looking at certain things directly is something adults have decided to stop doing. She was 9 years old. She was entirely healthy. She looked at the man in the orange jumpsuit with the tired face and the cuffed hands, and she simply looked at him, the way you might look at something that has stopped being dangerous and become instead just sad. Voss stopped walking. The officer beside him paused patient. And Harlan Voss, who had not flinched in the courtroom, who had argued in front of the sentencing judge, who had maintained through every phase of this process the posture of a man who believed himself fundamentally correct, looked at a 9-year-old girl in a yellow-flowered dress looking at him without fear, and he lowered his head. Not for the camera, not for the room. Just down. The officer moved them forward, and Lily watched them go for a moment, and then she opened her sketchbook to a blank page and bent her head over it, beginning something new already somewhere else. Harlan Voss received his 22 years and walked into it without the ceremony he had once been accustomed to receiving. No escort of colleagues, no deference, just the standard processing of a man who had been assigned a number. The Hamilton Restitution Fund built from the ruins of his estate, and Raymond Galt's development empire distributed compensation to over 300 verified victims of Project Pillar in the first 18 months of operation. Galt was arrested on the tarmac of Hamilton International Airport, attempting to board a private flight. His passport in his jacket and his phone still showing a one-way reservation, and the plane that was supposed to carry him away was seized instead and auctioned, and the proceeds went into the fund. 3 other judges whose names appeared in the Project Pillar notebooks resigned within 48 hours without explanation. The Hamilton County Courthouse reopened under the oversight of the state's first independent judicial review board, proposed, drafted, and advocated for by the State Bar Association under the leadership of its president. Diana Harmon became the coordinator of a tenant legal aid clinic that operates out of a storefront on Morrison Street, 2 blocks from the Callaway Cooperative Building, where she and Lily have lived for 6 months without a single maintenance request going unanswered. Derek Walsh used his restitution to buy back a portion of his grandfather's land, not the farmhouse, just the earth, and he planted trees on it and does not explain why to anyone who asks and does not need to. The name Elias Okafor was entered into the official investigation record, and a small bronze plaque bearing his name and the names of 31 other Project Pillar victims was installed on the courthouse steps at ground level at the height of a person standing. At the launch of the Okafor Justice Initiative, Lily Harmon sat in the front row in a dress with yellow flowers, and at the end of the ceremony, she raised her hand and asked Nadia in front of everyone, "Did you ever get scared?" And Nadia looked at her for a moment. This child who had drawn her as the one who stays on a morning when she was still deciding whether she had the courage to be exactly that, and she said, "Every single day." And I went anyway. Lily nodded slowly with the satisfaction of someone who has received the answer they came for, and closed her sketchbook, and the room was very quiet, and the quiet was the good kind. If this story moved you, if you believe that justice belongs to everyone who walks through those courthouse doors, not just the ones with titles, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to our channel and hit the bell so you never miss another story about the people who stood up when standing up cost something. Leave us a comment. What was the moment that stayed with you? We read every one.